Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Strategy Talks and Mechanics Guide series. In this episode, I wanted to discuss something that isn't actually going to affect your game at all, but it's something that is going to affect all of your friends' games. I know it's something that a lot of people have questions about, and it's honestly a very heavily debated topic. But I wanted to give my 2 cents about it, and that is the concept of candy sending etiquette. Now, for those of you that don't know, every morning when you go through your daily sleep session, and then there's a picture that you can select of which thing to show your friends. Whichever picture you select is the candy that all of your friends receive when you go to do your, when you look at your research community. So it varies. A lot of people don't realize it, but if you just leave it default, whatever it is, then your friends get whatever candy that is. That's what leads to a lot of people getting Wobbuffet candies or things like that, because the game defaults to some not the best options. So you really should be trying to change it just for the better etiquette of your friends. And if you send bad candy, then there are some people that will actually drop friends because they're sending bad candy. So it may kind of impact your game because you might lose friends if you're not following some candy sending etiquette. But generally, I'd say as long as you're sending something okay, you're probably not going to run into problems. It's just avoid certain really bad things, but there are some ways that I think we can be a bit more conscious of which candies are really the best ones for us to be sending out. Because sometimes I don't think it's always the what people think they want isn't necessarily what's actually best for them to be receiving. And I just kind of wanted to cover why some of that might be, and maybe what 5 factors that you should consider when you're thinking about which candies to send out. Now, the first that I wanted to talk about was rarity. Now, rarity is a relatively difficult concept to discuss, but I think there are 2 major points here. First, the one that I brought up on top is Raichu versus Weavile. Now, I think you should consider rarity. Now, all these 5 factors, I will say, are in no particular order. I think all of them need to be weighted, and you need to consider on a case-by-case basis which one's the best for you to send out. But rarity is something to consider. Now, comparing Raichu to Weavile, they're both very powerful berry specialists. The comparison is pretty good. I'd say they hold very similar spots in the meta for those that have good versions of them. But Weavile is much, much rarer. Somebody who is on the other end, who has both a Raichu and a Weavile, probably already has that Raichu at level 60. It's not very difficult to level Raichus. In fact, it's one of the easiest Pokemon in the game to split invest because Pichu and Pikachu are so common. Meanwhile, Weavile is basically an island exclusive. It exists at Greengrass and Snowdrop, which you're rarely going to encounter at Greengrass or Sneasel. So it's almost an island exclusive, and it's a 16-pip Pokemon that is much rarer to spawn at its base rate, or base evolution. So Weavile candy is going to be much rarer than, say, Raichu candy would be for anyone that's making those investments. So it's probably better to send out a Weavile candy over a Raichu candy. Now, the second comparison that I made is Beware versus Golem. Now, neither of these Pokemon are too rare on their individual sleep styles, but the reason why I'm mentioning it is because Beware is an island exclusive. Truly, if you are investing in Beware, it's going to be pretty difficult to get those candies because your only option for farming candies for Beware is Greengrass, or not Greengrass, sorry, Lapis. Golem, on the other hand, spawns at 4 different, or Geodude, at least. Golem itself only spawns at top, but Geodude spawns at Greengrass. It spawns at 4 different islands. Old Gold, Greengrass, Top, and I think maybe Cyan. I know there's a 4th one. I don't remember which one it is. Write in the comments if you know. But Geodude spawns at 4 different islands. Beware only spawns at 1. Even if they are equal rarity, which I don't know what their drowsy power requirements are, but even if they were, say, equal rarity, Stuffle versus Geodude, that doesn't matter. Stuffle's going to be a lot more rare. It's going to be a lot more difficult to collect candies for, just because it spawns exclusively at Lapis. So that's some things to consider about rarity. The second point I wanted to discuss was strength. Now, as for how good a Pokemon is in the meta at any given time, that's a huge debatable topic. I've included 2 tier lists in this image here. This tier list is one I pulled from the Pokemon Sleep Discord that was made by a composite of a bunch of different factors. by a bunch of different members of the community to determine what Pokemon are the strongest in this game. Tier lists are flawed innately, but they are kind of a way to get an idea of what might be good based off some people's opinions. This one in this corner is actually my tier list that I made, so that's where these tier lists come from. But either way, think about what you think is strong in the game. Think about what other people might say is strong in the game, and consider that. Because realistically, it doesn't matter how... Let's say Persian. Persian here is in the bottom tiers of both of these tier lists. You can make Persian be only spawning once in a blue moon, if we take the concept of Rarity from earlier, and you can make him check all these other boxes that I'm going to start listing off. But if that strength is a 0, nobody's using Persian because it sucks. So it is something to also consider, is how strong is the Pokemon, how many people are using it, because if nobody's using it, ultimately, that candy is going to be nothing but cramomatic filler in the end. So that is something else to consider, which is why I'd say never send out Persian candy. And any of the Pokemon that are in like the bottom tiers of either of these tier lists are probably not the best candy to be sending out overall. Next is newness. Now, newness is a very interesting concept. I put in a picture of Blissey here just because it's the most new Pokemon as of me making this video. But this really can apply to any Pokemon that they add here going forward. Because a new Pokemon, it is something else to consider, because if it is new, and there were no, like, if it's not like a regional variant or something, then nobody's going to have candy for it yet. So if anybody wants to catch the new Pokemon and use it right away, then ultimately, they're not going to have the candies available to them unless they spend handy candies on it. So getting the new Pokemon's candies is going to be more valuable if it is something that is worthwhile using. But once again, consider strength. If it's not a good Pokemon, I think this was a problem. A lot of people sent out Musharna and Muna candies back when it came out, but it wasn't a good Pokemon. So they didn't really consider strength when sending out those candies. I know I got bombarded with them every morning, and I was like, ugh. But anyway, newness is something to consider. Chansey, actually a pretty powerful Pokemon, especially when compared to the rest of the meta. It also might have some rarity issues. There's another discussion there, but it was new. So sending out candies was actually a pretty good option, even if there were other options that might have, under normal circumstances and the Pokemon not being necessarily so new, might have been a better option. But with the context of it being new, it is worth sending out, because people that want to use it are going to want to invest right away, and they're not going to have the resources to do that unless you send out those candies for the new Pokemon. Next one is usefulness. Now, I wanted to discuss this one because I think that a lot of people think of the other ones more often than... We're starting to get more into the nitty-gritty of things, but maybe this will make up tiebreakers, and maybe this is actually consideration. But the first one that I wanted to mention when it comes to usefulness is just the concept of how useful is that individual candy? How much value can you get out of that candy? And the first one that I wanted to talk about was pseudos versus non-pseudos. So I brought up the comparison of Dragonite versus Skeledirge. Both are pretty rare Pokemon. Skeledirge is probably a bit more common because it's not an island exclusive, but they both have a lot going for them. They're both ingredient specialists, pretty high up there in the meta, producing boatloads of their designated ingredients. They also have, interestingly, the same main skill, so they're very comparable Pokemon. But ultimately, you want more pseudo-legendary candies, because pseudo-legendaries are much more difficult to level. So those candies are ultimately more useful because it takes more of them to level up a Pokemon. Now, you're getting technically less value of comparative to the XP leveling curve on a pseudo-legendary versus a non-pseudo, but because it takes more, you want more. So that's where I'm saying, consider the usefulness factor. Legendaries and pseudo-legendaries, their candies are much more useful because you need more of them to level those Pokemon. It's going to take you longer to hit max level when building up a lot of those candies. So it is another factor to consider. Now, the second comparison that I have here is Raichu versus Wigglytuff. Now, both are really common Pokemon, as I discussed earlier. But which one of these is the better one to send out? And both are very powerful in the meta, despite being very common. So, which one's the better candy to send out? Well, in my opinion, the Raichu. Just because Wigglytuff's a skill specialist. Now, you gotta consider, what does a candy gain you? Well, a candy ultimately gains you levels. And what are levels useful for? Primarily berry strength, or reaching different breakpoints. Now, skill specialists, they don't really have very many breakpoints. Realistically, levels 10, 25, and 50 are the only 3 real significant breakpoints for skill specialists. And most of the leveling, the highest amount of XP is required from level 50 to 65 if you're trying to get to max. So realistically, a skill specialist doesn't really need that much candy if they don't depend upon their berry value. Now, there are some skill specialists that do care about their berry value and subsequently do care about their level, most notably Cresselia, Braviary, and Mimikyu. And to some smaller extent, the legendary beasts, Arcanine, Gallade, because they might proc on themselves, getting more berry value. So, there are some skill specialists that do care about their individual level. But for the most part, skill specialists don't care about their level, they care about their skill level. So, you don't need to necessarily send out their candy as often as other Pokemon. As often as berry specialists, per se. Now, I think ingredient specialists are in a weird middle ground between them, between berry and skill specialists, just because ingredient specialists, they don't necessarily care about their level, but their level 60 breakpoint is still a very, very significant breakpoint for ingredient specialists as far as leveling goes, and it's a very difficult one to get to, because basically, level 50 is it's just barely past the halfway point from level 1 to level 60. So, it takes a lot more XP to get an ingredient specialist to its next breakpoint, or to its most significant breakpoint of level 60, compared to the significant breakpoints for skill specialists. But berry specialists care about every single level, and every single level beyond level 60 even. So, that's why I think as far as usefulness goes, berry specialists and skill specialists that can make usage out of their level take priority, followed by ingredient specialists, followed by other skill specialists. So that's where I'd say usefulness comes into play. And then finally, I'd say dual purposes. Now, this is another factor for consideration, and I put the 4 examples that I could think of. There might be more in the game right now, but some of these have dual purpose candies. Like I said, I don't know if there are more, but these are the 4 that I can think of. And that's candies that can be used on multiple species because of 2 reasons it's worth consideration. Because 1, it's more likely that any given person will be making a split investment if they catch good variants of both of those. And 2, if you look at any given person, it's more likely that they'll have a Pokemon that can use that candy in their party, because there's now 2 species that are significant to invest in, or more in Eevee's case. So it's worth considering that some of these Pokemon use dual-purpose candies. With Wooper candies, we have Wooper and Paldean Wooper. Clodsire and Quagsire are both very significant Pokemon in the meta. Vulpix, you have Cantonian and Alolan Vulpix, both very powerful berry specialists. Pikachu isn't really a dual purpose, but it kind of is, because there's the Holiday Hat Pikachu and the Halloween Hat Pikachu. Halloween Hat Pikachu is much more significant than Holiday Hat, but for people that have a Halloween Hat Pikachu, it's another potential purpose, even though it's the same job, realistically. And then Eevee is used in a boatload of ways. Now, I'd say Eevee, it's a candy that I personally steer away from, just because it is so common that commonality, if we go back to the rarity point way back here, it's such a common Pokemon, and its evolutions spawn at every single island, that I think that kind of outranks the value in it having dual purpose, because I think you can get a lot of Eevee candy just by playing the game naturally, but it is something to consider that maybe Eevee candy might be more useful than other things that spawn. But ultimately, when you look across the Pokemon that you see every morning, which one's the best one to send out? You can't really go wrong as long as you're not sending out like some of the bottom tier Pokemon. That's really the only way to truly mess up, because you have 50 friends. And ultimately, most of the Pokemon in the game are getting used by someone, and you can probably, if you send out a candy that isn't just something absolutely awful, there's probably someone on your friends list that can make usage of it. And that's one concept that I wanted to discuss, because a while back, I actually had a personal experience with something, and it can be difficult for someone who's investing Pokemon that are less meta relevant because they caught a good variant of one. Now, my personal story from this was I caught a really good Doug Trio. And Doug Trio was very overlooked or not necessarily overlooked, but it wasn't very significant in the meta because it's not the best League Farmer. But I had a very good Doug Trio, and I was trying oh so desperately to level it. But nobody was ever sending Diglett candies, and Diglett's not a very common Pokemon. And because of that, I was struggling to get that Doug Trio up there in level. He still isn't very high in level, and I still don't have very many candies for him. And I ended up actually investing in Quaquaval instead because I caught a pretty good one, and people actually send candies for Quaquaval. It's actually a relevant Pokemon in the meta. But in my case, nobody was sending me Doug Trio candies. I wasn't able to get that Pokemon leveled. If somebody had sent it to me, I personally would have appreciated it. So even if you're sending something that is less meta relevant, I'd be willing to bet that there's somebody in your list that is probably using that Pokemon because they caught an absolutely cracked variant of that specific Pokemon. So as long as you're not sending like Persian or Wobbuffet, you're probably not making a mistake. All of this is just advice to try and help as many people as possible, because the goal of this is not necessarily to try and make sure that you're always helping someone. It's to try and help a majority of your friends list instead of just some. So, if you have enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Down in the description, I'll have a link to join the Discord. You can come join us, hang out, talk about all things Pokemon Sleep and the like this. I've also got the join button down below. If you want to support the channel and are financially capable of doing so, feel free to click that button. I don't really have any paid rewards for members, but the option's there if you want to show your support. And I do give a huge thank you to all of my channel members. It is very well appreciated. And as always, I thank you all for watching and hope that you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye now.